The names carved into the granite facades of America's most distinguished institutions tell a story that most people walk past without a second thought. Massachusetts General Hospital stands as a testament to medical innovation. McLean Hospital represents advances in psychiatric care, and the Boston Athenaeum embodies America's early commitment to intellectual life. Yet beneath these noble contributions lies a foundation built on something far darker than most Americans have ever been taught to consider. The families whose fortunes erected these buildings, the Perkins, the Forbes, the Delanos, the Russells, are remembered today as Boston's aristocratic elite, the so-called Brahmins who shaped American finance, industry, and culture during the nation's formative decades. Their wealth funded railroads that crossed the continent, universities that educated generations of leaders, museums that preserved artistic heritage, and hospitals that saved countless lives. But the origin of that wealth, the mechanism by which these families accumulated the capital necessary to build an empire, was a systematic enterprise of smuggling Turkish and Indian opium into China, turning millions of Chinese citizens into addicts, while violating Chinese law and contributing to the destabilization of an ancient civilization. This documentary examines how fortunes forged in exploitation and addiction were transformed into the respectable pillars of American society, and what this hidden history reveals about the economic foundations of the nation and the moral contradictions that still echo through modern financial empires. Understanding this transformation requires staying with this story until its conclusion, because the connections between 19th century drug smuggling and 21st century wealth are far more direct and consequential than most people realize. And I encourage you to watch through to the end and share in the comments where you're watching from, what city and country. Because this history belongs to all of us and demands a reckoning that transcends borders and generations. The economic landscape of early 19th century America was defined by a young nation desperate for capital, hungry for international legitimacy, and determined to establish trade routes that didn't depend on British intermediaries or European colonial networks. The China trade represented the most lucrative opportunity available to American merchants, offering access to tea, silk, porcelain, and other luxury goods that commanded premium prices in American and European markets. However, the Chinese economy presented a fundamental problem for Western traders. China produced nearly everything it needed domestically and had little interest in Western manufactured goods, which meant that European and American merchants had to pay for Chinese exports in silver, creating a massive outflow of precious metals that drained Western treasuries and made the trade economically unsustainable for anyone except those who could find something the Chinese market would accept in exchange. The British East India Company solved this problem by cultivating opium in India and smuggling it into China, creating an artificial demand for a product that reversed the flow of silver and turned the China trade into one of the most profitable enterprises in human history. American merchants, excluded from British colonial networks in India, initially struggled to compete until they identified an alternative source: Turkish opium grown in the interior regions around Izmir, which became the foundation for American participation in what would eventually become the largest drug trafficking operation the world had ever seen. The pioneers of the American opium enterprise were the Wilcox brothers from Philadelphia, Benjamin Chew and James Smith, who traveled as supercargoes on the first American ship to carry Turkish opium to China and established trade relations with Parsi merchants in Bombay, who served as intermediaries in the complex supply chains that connected Turkish poppy fields to Chinese smuggling networks. By 1824, Benjamin Chew Wilcox was conducting business worth 100,000 silver dollars annually with Hormuzji Dorabji of Bombay, and this volume grew steadily until his retirement in 1827, when he passed the enterprise to relatives who further developed connections with prominent Parsi merchant families, including the Khawasji, Framji, and Hormuzji clans. The Philadelphia operation demonstrated the viability of American participation in the opium trade, But it was Boston's merchants who would transform occasional trafficking into systematic empire building. The Perkins family, led by Thomas Handasad Perkins and his brother James, created what insiders called the Concern, an intermarried network of relatives and trusted associates that controlled the largest share of American opium smuggling by the early 1820s. Thomas Perkins had built his initial capital through slave trading in Saint-Domingue and maritime fur trading between the American Northwest and China. But he recognized that opium offered profits that dwarfed any other commodity, and he committed his enterprise fully to the drug trade. In the early 1800s, the British controlled 90% of the Chinese opium market. But within the 10% handled by Americans, Perkins and Company dominated, owning at least 7 ships outright and holding interests in numerous others that sailed from Massachusetts to Turkey to purchase opium, then to China to sell it, and finally back to Boston, loaded with tea, silk, and porcelain purchased with the proceeds of addiction. The operational genius of the Perkins enterprise lay in its nephew John Perkins Cushing, who established permanent year-round operations in Canton and developed the smuggling infrastructure that would become the model for all subsequent American involvement in the trade. Cushing recognized that the greatest risk in opium smuggling came from attempting to bring illegal cargo into Chinese ports, where customs officials could seize ships and imprison crews. So he pioneered a system where Perkins vessels would anchor off the small island of Lintin at the mouth of the Pearl River and establish floating warehouses that never technically entered Chinese territorial waters. Chinese smugglers would row out to these anchored ships, purchase opium in bulk, and then transport it inland through networks of corrupt officials and criminal organizations that handled the final distribution. This arrangement allowed American merchants to profit from smuggling without bearing the direct legal consequences. And the system proved so successful that ships remained permanently stationed at Lintin, serving as offshore storage facilities that processed a continuous flow of narcotics. The profits were staggering. Thomas Perkins' wealth reached more than $1 million by 1826, equivalent to approximately $25 million in contemporary purchasing power. And this represented only his personal fortune, not the cumulative wealth generated for the extended network of family members and business associates who participated in the concern. John Perkins Cushing became so wealthy that he effectively controlled the price of opium in the Canton market, purchasing such quantities of Turkish supply that he could manipulate availability and maximize profit margins. The Perkins enterprise generated what historians describe as tremendous revenue, making millionaires of multiple family members, not just Thomas Perkins himself, and creating a concentration of capital that would reshape American economic development for generations. While Perkins and Company dominated the early American opium trade, the enterprise that would ultimately become the largest American trafficking operation was Russell and Company, founded in 1818 when Providence merchants Edward Carrington, Cyrus Butler, and Benjamin and Thomas Hoppin contracted Samuel Russell to establish a resident commission firm in Canton. Russell arrived in Canton in 1819 and immediately began building relationships with Chinese merchants and developing supply chains for opium sourced from both Turkish and Indian networks. The company experienced financial difficulties during the Panic of 1819, which lasted through the mid-1820s. But Russell's commitment to the opium trade sustained the enterprise when other commodities failed to generate sufficient profit. By 1827, Russell had consolidated control of the company and began expanding operations aggressively. And in 1830, after absorbing the operations of Perkins and Company, Russell and Company became the dominant American firm in the China trade, competing directly with British giants like Jardine Matheson and Company and Dent and Company for control of the opium market. The company developed its own supply streams and trade networks that allowed it to dominate the Canton market by the 1830s, and by 1842, Russell and Company had become the largest American trading house in China, a position it maintained until its closure in 1891. The man who would run Russell and Company operations during its most profitable years was Warren Delano Jr., who arrived in China at age 24 and worked for the company from 1833 to 1846, 13 years of continuous involvement in drug trafficking that made him extraordinarily wealthy. Delano was the maternal grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and while no one knows precisely what the future president understood about his grandfather's drug trafficking career, the Delano fortune provided the financial foundation for one of America's most powerful political dynasties. The mechanics of the smuggling operation were sophisticated and required extensive networks of relationships with corrupt officials, criminal organizations, and Chinese merchants willing to violate their own government's laws. Ships carrying opium would send fast boats ahead to alert Russell and Company representatives of their impending arrival, then anchor at Lintin, where China...
In 1838, the emperor appointed Lin Zexu, a respected Confucian scholar and administrator, known for his incorruptibility and administrative competence, to serve as imperial commissioner with a mandate to end the opium trade by whatever means necessary. Lin arrived in Guangzhou in March 1839 and immediately demanded that all foreign merchants surrender their opium stocks, cease trafficking in the drug, and sign bonds pledging never to engage in the trade again under penalty of death. When foreign merchants made only token submissions, Lin escalated his tactics by confining several hundred merchants, including British Commissioner Charles Elliot, to their factories and holding them essentially as hostages until they complied with his demands. After 6 weeks of confinement with dwindling food supplies, the foreign merchants capitulated and turned over more than 20,000 chests of opium, totaling approximately 2.6 million pounds of the drug, representing the single largest drug seizure in human history to that point. Lin ordered the opium destroyed in a public ceremony that began on June 3, 1839 and lasted 23 days, during which more than 1,000 long tons of illegal opium were dissolved in trenches filled with lime and salt, then flushed into the sea at Humen Beach, in a demonstration intended to show the government's absolute determination to eliminate the trade. Lin wrote an open letter to Queen Victoria appealing to her moral responsibility to stop the opium trade, though she never received it, and he continued to fortify coastal defenses and seize additional opium shipments wherever his forces could locate them. The shortage of opium created by Lin's crackdown caused prices to skyrocket from $500 per chest to $3,000. Creating enormous profit opportunities for any merchant willing to risk smuggling during the crackdown. Warren Delano demonstrated exactly how American merchants responded to China's attempt to enforce its own laws. He took advantage of the chaos to maximize his personal profits while contributing to the military conflict that would force China to accept continued opium importation. When the British faced restrictions, Delano profited by taking tolls and helping British merchants evade Chinese enforcement. And in 1839, when the First Opium War erupted in full force, Delano accomplished what historians describe as the first military trade between the United States and China by selling a 900-ton British warship to Lin Zexu himself, the very official tasked with stopping the opium trade. The profound irony of this transaction reveals the extent to which personal profit superseded any consideration of law, morality, or national loyalty. An American opium smuggler sold military equipment to Chinese authorities while simultaneously continuing to smuggle the drug those authorities were trying to eliminate. The First Opium War lasted from 1840 to 1843. And resulted in a decisive British victory that forced China to accept the Treaty of Nanking, which ceded Hong Kong to Britain, opened 5 treaty ports to foreign trade, established fixed tariffs, and granted extraterritoriality to British subjects, meaning they could no longer be tried under Chinese law. American merchants recognized immediately that they needed similar privileges to compete effectively. And in July 1844, the United States signed the Treaty of Guangya, also known as the Treaty of Guangxia, which granted Americans the same privileges Britain had extracted through military force, plus additional rights including extraterritoriality for American citizens, fixed tariffs favorable to foreign merchants, and the right to purchase land and construct churches and hospitals in the treaty ports. These so-called unequal treaties fundamentally undermined Chinese sovereignty and established a framework of foreign privilege that would persist for nearly a century, contributing directly to the weakening of the Qing dynasty, the eventual collapse of imperial China, and the rise of nationalist and communist movements that defined 20th century Chinese history. While China declined under the weight of addiction, exploitation, and political fragmentation, foreign merchants who had profited from opium smuggling returned home as millionaires whose capital would reshape the American economy and fund the infrastructure of industrial development. If you're finding this examination of hidden economic history valuable, I encourage you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss future investigations into the origins of wealth and power. And please share in the comments where you're watching from, what city and country, because understanding how past exploitation connects to present inequality is a conversation that transcends borders and requires voices from every corner of the world. Warren Delano's fortune from 13 years of opium smuggling allowed him to return to the United States at age 33 as an extraordinarily wealthy man, a suitable match for Catherine Robbins Lyman, daughter of a Massachusetts Supreme Court judge, whom he married in 1843 before immediately sailing back to China for 3 more years of profitable trading. Warren Delano purchased an estate called Algonac at Danscomer Point, above Newburgh in the Hudson Valley, settling his growing family in the comfort and respectability that opium money could purchase. However, the Panic of 1857 destroyed much of Delano's invested wealth, forcing him to consider selling Algonac, and when no buyers emerged because nearly every American faced similar financial ruin, Delano made the decision to return once more to China to recoup his fortune through another 5 years of opium trading. Many people scoffed at his plan, believing that economic conditions had changed and that opportunities to accumulate vast wealth no longer existed. But Delano's experience and connections in the opium trade proved them wrong, and he successfully rebuilt his fortune during the 1860s, in part by shipping opium to the Medical Bureau of the United States War Department during the Civil War, a transaction that has been characterized as humanitarian assistance to wounded soldiers, but which functioned primarily as another profitable opium sale that restored the Delano family's wealth. Warren Delano and other wealthy Hudson Valley families, including the Roosevelts, did not experience the losses and devastation that the Civil War inflicted on most Americans, in part because the gentlemen of these families did not fight, insulated by their wealth from the conflict that killed more than 600,000 people and transformed American society. Delano's daughter, Sarah, married James Roosevelt and gave birth to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who would become the 32nd President of the United States. And while the precise extent of FDR's knowledge about his grandfather's drug smuggling career remains unknown, there is no question that the Delano opium fortune provided the financial foundation for the family's Hudson Valley estate at Hyde Park, the lifestyle of inherited privilege that shaped Franklin's worldview, and the economic security that allowed him to pursue a political career without the necessity of earning substantial income. The Roosevelt family home at Hyde Park, now a National Historic Site, features interior decorations that reflect the lifestyle favored by this old money family. And the Rose Garden contains the graves of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, surrounded by grounds that opium profits purchased and maintained across generations. The Forbes family experienced a similar trajectory of wealth accumulation, investment, and intergenerational transfer that continues to shape American society in the 21st century. 11 members of the Forbes extended family traded in China between 1785 and 1887, profiting from tea and other exports as well as opium smuggling. And they used their acquired wealth for expansive philanthropic endeavors from which Americans still benefit, including hospitals, universities, museums, and cultural institutions. John Murray Forbes, who had accumulated his initial fortune smuggling opium during the 1820s and 1830s, became one of the most successful railroad investors of the 19th century, serving as president of the Michigan Central Railroad and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, and deploying capital that helped build the transportation infrastructure connecting the American continent. The Forbes family fortune eventually contributed to the founding of Forbes magazine, creating a media empire that ironically celebrates wealth and entrepreneurship, while rarely acknowledging that the founding family's capital originated in drug smuggling that addicted millions and destabilized China. The Perkins fortune funded Massachusetts General Hospital, McLean Hospital, and the Boston Athenaeum, institutions that still serve the public while bearing the names of men whose wealth came from addiction and exploitation. These families successfully integrated into Boston's aristocratic elite by intermarrying with other prominent families, including the Adamses, Cabots, Coolidges, Lodges, Lowes, Peabodys, and Saltonstalls, creating a consolidated upper class whose descendants continued to benefit from inherited wealth, social connections, and the compounding advantages that capital provides across generations. The transformation from drug smuggler to respected philanthropist required only a single generation and a strategic deployment of charitable giving that purchased social legitimacy while obscuring the criminal origins of accumulated capital. The parallels between 19th century opium fortunes and contemporary wealth built on pharmaceutical addiction are striking and deeply uncomfortable for Americans who prefer to believe that such patterns belong exclusively to the past. Purdue Pharma, owned by the Sackler family since 1952, generated more than $35 billion in revenue from OxyContin, a highly addictive opioid painkiller that the company